Hi, I'm Paul Verschoor, and in today's podcast, I'm speaking with Professor Rob van der Laarse about the cultural landscapes and competing memories involved in collaboration. Rob trained as a historian and in his research built bridges to cultural studies and anthropology. As research director of the Amsterdam School for Heritage and Memory Studies and professor for War, Heritage and Memory at the University of Amsterdam, Rob takes a retrospective look at collaboration in the Netherlands during the period of the Second World War. So welcome, Rob. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Paul.
So Rob, maybe we could start with you giving us a quick sketch of your professional development that brought you to the point where you are today.
You mean in collaboration?
No, in general, just if we understand a little bit the expertise that you bring to the discussion.
I'm trained as a historian, and I worked actually for 20 years as a historian in the history department of the University of Amsterdam. And I've done a lot of things, broad periods and mostly theory, but also cultural history for long periods in Europe, in the Netherlands, etc. And from there, I moved into the cultural science department around 2000, which I found very interesting. I was a cultural historian, as I said, trained also as an anthropologist. And there were a lot of new initiatives among them, for instance, media studies, which we founded at that time. I've been part of that of that department for, let's say, 2 years. And then I found some kind of new interest in let's say, the whole fascination with the past, which you could find far outside history department at that time. Which of course we now all call heritage and memory, etc., which was quite new in the early 21st century. So I started master programs in heritage and memory studies and museum studies. And then we became a kind of apartment with restoration and conservation and curating expertise. Actually, nowadays, a quite broad session, also part of the media studies, for instance, and archival sciences and in film studies. And then from all these expertise, we created a new kind of research institute called the Amsterdam School for Heritage and Memory and Material Culture, which is now one of the most advanced of the 6 faculty of humanities schools. It's completely facilitated and part of the faculty management structure. And after doing all that, I'm actually now moving in a sort of, I'm back to my earlier position. I'm now head of the cultural sciences department, which actually needs some kind of refreshment. So they took the old guy like me to support that. That's basically my task now. But I have all the expertise, of course, in house. And as you know, also already from at about 2000, 2010, in that period, we started large projects. One of them, one of the largest, was called Dynamics of Memory. It was a big, broad NWO project in the Netherlands. Actually, some 5 years before, I already was a kind of advisor of the government, some government ministries of welfare and education, for instance. And in that, I was one of the advisors of the Heritage of War program. And from that, some huge national program in the Netherlands started, Dynamics of Memory, which was broadly sponsored by all the ministries and by a lot of museums and heritage institutes and funds. And that brought me for some 5-6 years to, let's say, literally evaluating some 300 projects on new technology, digitization in particular, which was absolutely new in 2005. By discussing that, the idea was actually that the Second World War, was going with pension, as it was called. They would expect no new generation to be interested in that old stuff. So they said, yeah, we want to close actually those resistance museums and all that nonsense. And we have a sort of archive with the Red Cross, with the names of Red Cross victims. What can we do with it? NIOD at that time, the National Institute for War History, wasn't interested. And they said, well, there is some sort of fool at the University of Amsterdam who's interested in heritage. Go talk with him. Well, that became then the largest program ever created by ministries together in science, the Heritage War program. And we connected to NWO, which started Dynamics of Memory. And And from that, everything changed slowly. I started international projects like Terrascapes, for instance, which is still an existing network, programs with Cambridge University, where they were also interested in heritage research. People like David Lowenthal at that time, a lot of expertise brought together. And that ended in the kind of collaboration with we worked together, Paul, the Assessing Campscapes project, ICXs, which was a very interesting project ERA funded in Horizon 2020, which brought together a lot of universities, six European universities, and six campscapes, which grew, of course, later on to some eight of each, and a lot of companies working in, especially also in fields of digitization and visualization. Well, that's there are other projects which I'm still in working on. Like on critical heritage, future of Europe, that these kind of training programs. There are sort of let's say spin-offs of this ICXS project, like Houses of Darkness, which work with three of these campscapes together in visualization technology. So there's a lot being done, but there's also a lot still to collaborate. Let's say with future partners.
Right.
Because this
So Rob, you enter this discussion on collaboration is sort of well prepared in the context of memory studies and conflict history. But now, what is collaboration and what purpose does it serve?
Yeah, collaboration is, well, we know, of course, all about these collaborative research grants, like in Europe. Collaboration is let's say technically, it's an interesting Latin term, of course, which I think first became known in normal speech only in France at the end of the 19th century, the period of Ernst Renan, those nation state building concepts, which means that collaboration was doing something bad. Huh? I mean, collaboration, we now see it as a positive term in Europe, as working together to achieve a lot of things like research. But collaboration had a long history already, going back to this actually working with the enemy, you could say. It became very negative in the Netherlands. If people say to me, would you like to collaborate? Then in the Dutch pronunciation, collaboratie actually only means one thing, which is working with the enemy, the occupying forces. And in worse sense, and that is, of course, now the nation state becomes less important. For many people now, newer generation, it means working together in genocide processes or the Holocaust or something like that. So collaboration in that sense is a negative term in the Netherlands, but let's say the Anglo-Saxon and also in France, in the Anglo-Saxon culture, it has this double meaning. Some has found an escape on that. I think it's necessary sometimes to use that, to speak about collaboration and about collaborationism. Collaborationism is then what the Dutch called collaboratie. And collaboration is more what in Dutch language would be called samenwerking, working together. So in that sense, I think we can use the term collaboration in European way, while knowing actually that some European countries with an occupying history have some sort of negative connotation with the term. But of course, this negative connotation is actually what you would mean with a concept like collaborationism.
Right. But now, could you unpack this a little bit with respect to these origins in the emergence of the nation state? What?
Yeah, a nation state is a 19th century invention. Although we, of course, as a historian, I can say, let's say the department I was part of for some time was called the Dutch history section, let's say, which means that every country in the world has since at about 1870, not before, shares in national history. And how strange it seemed before that there was no national history. There was a history, of course, a history of regions, of what was called states. Also in a small country like the Netherlands, the term states was actually used for what we now call provinces. In Germany, you can still find the term states for the different duchies, for example. The different parts of the country all had their own typical state organization, like you see also in the US, for instance. To call all that together a state, a nation, that is really a 19th century invention, starting, of course, in the late Romantics, after the French Revolution, you could say, from let's say the 1820s, 1830s. There was this general idea that people were not living together simply because there was a king or an emperor or whatever who created a kind of structure of all these different smaller noble estates or something like that. But that there was also kind of natural cooperation between people. There you see already a term like cooperations big S to drop up. And that idea is that people shared something, like a language, for instance, like a history, like a past. So to create this kind of cultural, this imagined community, as Benedict Anderson would call it, that really means you have to invent a history, which explains later on when this nationalism became more rigid and more competitive in a European context, especially between countries like Germany and France, for instance, that these history became, let's say, were rewritten. They were rewritten in a national context, in a national dynamic. Now, how remarkable this is, that when we started, for instance, Dynamics of Memory as a European project, that I was one of the co-editors of a volume which we started with the idea that we tried to find out how this history of the Second World War, I mean, we talk about a world war, and the Holocaust, were actually completely written in a different narrative in all these European countries. And that is quite remarkable. It means that even international phenomena are in Europe still up to today being understood from a national frame. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with the invention of the nation state. And this nation state, you could say, formally its invention, let's say, at about 1813, 1815. But as a cultural concept with this notion of history that people felt to belong to each other, that dates from at about 1870.
But then
from that period on.
What did the term really describe in that sense? Was it the identification of an individual with an opposing nation state, like in some sort of, in terms of an identity? So what purpose did it serve when it arose?
Yeah, the remarkable thing is that people started to identify, of course, with a culture, which was originally a regional culture, and then it became nationalized. So in these different parts of one country, they felt to be friends. For instance, it's a great book written with an American historian, Eugene Weber, who called the title of the book is From Peasants into Frenchmen. And this whole process starts in 1870 and ends in 1914. So you see very late French people who spoke all kinds of different patois, different dialects, were trained by the same school system, etc., to feel themselves friends in first instance. Now, that happened in many countries. And what happened is not only that they felt themselves to belong to one country, which is a nation, but also connected that to a state. So the nation became a nation state. They became loyal to a state, which means that people started to fight for that state as in an army. Now, conscription armies also date only from after 1870. So only the First World War was the first moment that you could say that labor classes went to war. Which was a tragedy, by the way, of course, because socialism was international at that time and couldn't expect it to happen. But what you see already then in 1914, the First World War was not only a clash between France and Germany, it was actually also already then the disaster of socialism, because it made perfectly clear to all the nation states that nationalism had won, that nationalism was stronger than socialism. Now, one guy, as we know, was very clever in understanding that the combination of these two, National Socialism, was, of course, the winning formula.
Exactly.
And, yeah, exactly. That is what happened. But let's say what you see from 1870 on and after this First World War is that people became more and more loyal to a state. They paid their taxes, and it was absolutely not done in the 19th century still. I mean, this is a very recent invention. And after the Second World War only, we created this welfare state, that the state took care of all these right. people. So,
but now can we look under the hood? Can we look under the hood of this in terms of what are then the underlying features, right? So what defines that collaboration with the nation state?
Yeah, that is the collaboration. The remarkable thing is that collaboration is actually what happened in behavior between the relationship between state and citizen became that of collaboration. But during the First World War, and more especially during the Second World War, collaboration, which was already a phenomenon, which was actually the basis of the modern nation state, suddenly became a negative concept, because it means collaboration became working together as citizens or as states with occupying powers. So it means actually that you were collaborating with the occupier. And that had everything to do, of course, with the invention of the nation state. Because, let's say, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, when a country was occupied, it was completely normal to collaborate with a new with a new state, with a new authority. That was the general way everything works. Now, officially, this was even still so in the Second World War, when the Dutch government, for instance, took exile in London. They let know to the Dutch administrations that they had to collaborate with the German occupier. That was official policy and legitimized. So that happened. All this local and regional government institutes worked together with the Germans as if nothing had changed. They took over the national government, of course, appointed their own fascist collaborators, so to say, in central, crucial administrative position. But all the others, the thousands, 10,000s of others, including school teachers, etc., everyone stayed in business. And after the war, of course, we're accused of collaboration. I think also at economic collaboration. But in a certain way, even tax paying was collaboration. Now, this is a sort of absurdity, because collaboration was the normal way of working together in the state. But because of this negative impact of occupation, which was in many countries new, in the sense that in many countries, nation states, let's say, before that was normal, but after the nation state, it was generally they only work together with a nation state. So working together with an enemy nation state then became a negative concept, became a kind of treason. And but because it was, on the other hand, completely legitimate behavior, up to today, among historians, there's a big debate about what actually collaboration is, because economic collaboration or administrative collaboration at a certain level is completely normal. Without that, there would exist chaos. So to let trains do their work, etc., you need a kind of collaboration. But when the trains are transporting Jews to Auschwitz or Westerbork Auschwitz in the Netherlands, then this economic normal collaboration suddenly becomes a kind of morally wrong collaboration. Now, that's a debate which after the Second World War actually was not that strong. There were some kinds of, let's say, investigation communities. But how strange it is, let's say for France, for instance, we now today would say Vichy France was one group of collaborationists. I mean, these people were ideologically not going in resistance. They were actually serving the German occupying state. But because Vichy France, by the Germans, was given the illusion of being the continuation of a free French state, after 1944, when the Allied forces invaded France and liberated it from the Germans, Vichy immediately changed position and said, we are still free, we didn't collaborate. So we now immediately start finding the collaborationists, those people who ideologically were working for the Germans. Thousands of them were already trialed in Vichy France. It's now forgotten because this is the wrong kind of memory, because now for us, whole Vichy France was actually collaborating. So you see that even after the Second World War, the term collaboration has changed extremely. I remember even from my own youth, for instance, that we had trials of those project developers worked for the Germans in building the Atlantic Wall. They were not regarded in the end as collaborationists, because the general idea was actually they did a good job by giving the Germans the illusions that they worked for them with Dutch people who didn't have to go then to Germany, etc. So it was a kind of Robin Hood, kind of it was almost resistance, let's say.
But two dimensions popping up here, right? Because that means on the one hand, there is a tension between collaboration, which seems to suggest some form of free will, and coercion, like you cannot do anything else. And then there seems to be a very decisive element of a moral judgment, which again, of course, is linked to whatever the root of history is at that point in time.
Exactly.
So first is linked with coercion. In some sense, you could say, look, if I work within the context of a nation state, you might describe my engagement as collaboration, but there's nothing else I can do. I'm essentially coerced into going along, right? So how should we disentangle these two elements?
Let's say in trials, for instance, this term collaboration is still the general term used. That means that you always have to deal with the complexity that the complexity that economic or administrative collaboration in a certain way is held on the same level as ideological collaboration, being a camp guard, for instance, or something like that. Or better said, that a camp guard or a camp commander would always position himself as being actually only the administrative collaborator. If I wasn't there, someone much worse than me would probably have taken over, because I'm not anti-Semite or whatever. I'm not even pro-German or whatever. I did my job, and so that's the general idea everywhere in all occupied European countries. Was we were experts, we were asked, we did our best job, we were neutral, we were Fachleute, to say it in German, and that is possible. I mean, it's possible to use the term in that way, as if you were simply still in the normal existing collaboration with your own state. But because there was also resistance, and resistance was something working against that state, there has been, let's say, a moment to see this occupying state no longer as a legitimate state. So that was a state with, in the end, laws. That's always a good thing, of course. When it would have won the war, Germany, we wouldn't have this debate, of course. Mm-hmm. So it's all relative, let's say, history. But there's also a moral dimension. That is, in resistance is already a political moral dimension of being a good patriot or not. I mean, in many countries they were called, let's say, fighters for martyrs for the nation, even on all the monuments, partisans. And the problem is, of course, that also National Socialists, collaborating with the Germans, even fighting against the Russians, for instance, in the Russian wars in Eastern Germany and Russia, were also keeping themselves for being patriots. Also call themselves partisans sometimes. So the craziness is that there is almost nothing to divide, because this is, again, if you think back at the First World War, you could say this is the kind of nationalism that won that war, and that nationalism could be seen as very strongly focused on those countries occupied. You're a partisan where you fight against the occupier, but it could also be ideologically transmitted to fighting for that country which had the best national ideas. Let's say the National Socialists, who had better ideas than the communists, for instance. So fighting against Dutch communists would then be a patriot thing to do. Huh? Now, in that sense, terms like collaborations were very difficult to use in trials. And you see them used very much in public debates, because there's always this moral dimension that in some way it's bad. And it gets a new kind of dimension after the 1970s, 80s with the Holocaust narrative, because then it's no longer only working for the occupying country, whatever you think about that, but it's also being part of the SS or supporting by whatever, even if you were only, let's say, exploiting labor camps, for instance, like some Dutch almost government organizations have done, the Heidemaatschappij, the Moore Company. These created a lot of these camps in which Jews, for instance, were already having to work before the deportations to the extermination camp started. Now, all that kind of collaboration has been reviewed, you could say, or reframed from the perspective that we know what happened afterwards. We know in the end where it led to. And that makes collaboration again morally wrong. That is now the general, let's say, the general opinion, I think, which is shared by most Dutch people, at least, and most French people.
But that seems to be more a colloquial, informal definition, because you also highlighted already that in the actual court cases, apparently, as a concept, it didn't hold. So can you explain that? Was it really rejected offhand? Was it investigated?
What you saw immediately after the war was, of course, that collaborators, that the term was immediately used for treasoners, treasoners of the nation, you could say, what in Dutch is called landverraders. These were generally called collaborators. And they were sent then to the camps when the Jews were liberated from the camps. You could say the National Socialists and these specific group of collaborators were immediately sent and turned to these former concentration camps. And but in the end, you see that almost all trials failed. Because, what is a collaborator? I mean, a member of a National Socialist Party, it's clear that you're ideologically collaborating with that regime. That is possible, even if you personally never collaborated. I mean, it happened quite often. Let's say small farmers, for instance, in some parts of the country, who for whatever reasons became member of an organization that actually became a National Socialist organization, were of course accused of ideological collaboration, although they never probably ever worked for any German organization or did anything in that sense wrong. But those people who actually collaborated would say, okay, we collaborated because we had a position already before the war in the state apparatus. And we continue to do that because we wanted to keep the country together. And we were legitimized by the government in London. I mean, we actually collaborated for them. So that is very, very difficult to explain that there is what is the graduation? You can do that only at the moment when you really find proof that people also ideologically collaborated. So when this collaboration ended in, let's say, a membership of a National Socialist Party or organization, okay, then you could say now we know that you actually worked for the occupier. But this is you can see this is not a general way to fight.
However, there were also cases against the so-called traitors, Dutch citizens who actually directly worked for, let's say, the German Secret Service, the Gestapo, to infiltrate, let's say, resistance movements and get people arrested. These were cases that really also led to convictions.
Yeah,
and those cases was the word. Were these also seen collaborators, or was that then be called treason?
Because these people, collaboration is only possible when you have a position already in the state apparatus on whatever level, and then you start collaborating with the enemy. Let's say a government, let's say Denmark, for instance, or Norway. These governments who stay there, Belgium in a certain way, these governments collaborated with the Germans, the Balkans, for instance, the Ustasha regime or the Ukrainian nationalists. They collaborated. But if you start making a career as a secret agent without having a position before in the Netherlands, you could say you're just only your work for an enemy organization. So that is treason. Then you are in the service of another country's of the occupier, let's say the occupier's military or police organization. But that is a strange concept, because the same concept is also used against communists who went in the 1930s to Spain to fight against the fascists. They lost their citizenship in the Netherlands, and they only received it back, some of them only in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though they were active resistance fighters during the Second World War, I mean, you couldn't be more patriot than that, you could say. But they never earned that back. And they lost their jobs actually to National Socialists who came back from the camps in the early 50s or the late 40s. Because then Cold War started, and also because of that, they were still not held for trustful citizens. So collaboration can take very, very strange ways, but also this kind of treason, because these people were also accused of having been served not an enemy state, but simply a foreign state. and fought against the Germans, which was still, before the Second World War, still a befriended nation. So if you fought against German army, for instance, in Spain in 1936 to 1938 or whatever, then you were actually fighting in the service of a Spanish government, although officially Spain was a befriended nation, the Republic. The Netherlands, for instance, forgot that and say, okay, no, but you were fighting against those Germans, and that's a befriended nation. So you see, this concept is also absolutely weird. And there is another way, of course, to escape it. Let's say many of these people working for the Germans, police people or whatever, after the war, they simply went to Germany. If these people lived in Groningen, for instance, or in Asse, near the German frontier, or in Limburg, they simply had to move 50 kilometers. And they lived in Germany. And many of them, most of them have now, of course, they died. But let's say up to not too long ago, many of them lived there in a completely normal life. They had a death sentence or whatever in the Netherlands. But the Netherlands were not able to catch them because the German government were not allowing them to deliver them to the Dutch state. And that is, this is another case of the complexity of what it means. Collaboration let's say the Germans would say they collaborated in a positive way for us. They collaborated in the occupation. For the Netherlands, the collaboration was not the worst thing. You could not be trialed very seriously for collaboration. It was more what actually what they did that was working for a foreign occupying organization, and let's say be taken part in killings of resistance fighters, for instance. That was most of the job which they were accused.
Right, but now if you step back from the nation state perspective in collaboration, then defining features are, for instance, shared goals, right? Entities, agents can collaborate because there's a shared goal. But now in this context, there's an asymmetry because we speak of a nation state or the idea of a nation state and all its organizations and an individual. So would you think that also in that context, there's still a sense of a shared goal, or should we just redefine that?
That's a good question, Paul, because it is the strange thing of the concept is also that it's used for states, governments collaborating with the occupying countries, or collaborating not with an occupying country, but with the Axis countries, for example, by the promise of being independent, like Vichy regime, or like some of the Eastern European countries, or Denmark. Denmark delivered its Jews, for instance, on the promise of being independent, and even social democrats were in the governments there. They also delivered the communists. So that was good for the social democrats because he were competitors, of course. So you see, collaboration on the government level was also quite normal and usual during wartime. But of course, we generally use the term in the Netherlands, for instance, collaboratie, not on that level. Although this is probably the only level which you can really use it in a neutral way, let's say, because this is something which you really can define. But generally, in public speech, the term is mostly used for this citizenship, these citizens who collaborate with the enemy. And there it becomes blurred, because what's collaboration for one citizen is not collaboration for another citizen. For instance, the famous case of the major in wartime, the burgemeester in the oorlog. This is the Dutch concept to make clear how problematic some things could be. Suppose you're a burgomaster, you're a major of a small village or a larger town, and people want you to stay because they trust you during this occupation, and they know that you can probably help to, let's say, to moderate the situation, which is actually, of course, based on negotiations. Then after the war, formally, you could be accused, and they have been accused, of collaboration. Now, this was, in that sense, not ideological collaboration and not morally wrong, because they probably, some of them even hided a lot of Jews, for instance. They supported that. Of course, others were ideologically wrong. They were really collaborating in the sense that they worked the other way around, but these were mostly appointed by the occupying regime. Now you see that even their collaboration already is blurred. But what happens with all these cases? Let's say a famous case is the Jewish Council, the Joodse the Jewish Council, that the Germans invented based on some members of the Jewish elite in Amsterdam, famous among the Jews themselves, already before the war, in supporting German Jews, for instance, refugee camps. They were also, of course, those people who created Westerbork in that sense, originally as a German Jewish refugee camp. Now, these people became then appointed by the Germans after the occupation as representing the Jews in the Netherlands, in particular in Amsterdam. And slowly they became, instead of representing, became collaborating in making the list, in registration, in selecting those people to be sent to the camps. Mm-hmm. Every time, with every new step, with the idea, now, we take this 1,000 for this week, and maybe then we save some 500 others, up to the moment that no one was left, and they had to be sent themselves to the camps.
Mm-hmm. So but now but this is an important step, right? Because that means the German occupier put in motion a process where they also engineered this collaboration, as you just described it. Would you agree with that? This was an engineered process?
This is exactly what it was, and it shows the cleverness of the German occupier. I mean, what I always want to make clear to students and colleagues is that fascism has nothing to do with primitivism or with backwardness or with people who are against change and, what you often find also now in interpretation of populism. These are those people who, like with Brexit, for instance, who don't want to be part of Europe because it's modern. No. National socialism, like fascism in Italy, were extremely modernist and extremely supported by people like us, for instance, like by intellectuals, by professors, by political powers. There was a lot of knowledge here, and they knew very, very well how to deal and how to occupy. They were really experts, maybe brilliant experts, and maybe the best occupiers ever existed. I mean, they did everything faster than the Roman Empire, for instance, than Napoleon. What they did was unbelievable. I mean, it's not comparable to anything on a world scale, and it could have been successful if not some stupid mistakes were made. That in the end, but I mean, successful in their own terms. For us, it would be disastrous. But
yeah.
So also in this whole, let's say, what they created was Jewish self-destruction, a system that you give the illusion to people. And this is exactly collaboration, like almost most like that we would be invited in Europe to work together with some other groups in a collaborative project. But actually, the collaborative project is selecting ourselves constantly to send yourself into a kind of unknown destruction machine. But you don't know it yourself. You think you're actually doing the right thing. Maybe in a certain way you think, well, maybe it is better for Jews to live somewhere in a new state like Israel, but then in the East, let's say. By all these strange illusions, I mean, there were so many plans also in the Netherlands. Why not sending the Jews to Suriname, for instance, where they had so many of these plantations?
What's the mechanics here? So May 40, German invasion in Holland. Then they wait quite a while, actually, before they really start to ramp up this process of engineering collaboration. So what, in your mind, are then the key steps in that process that led to, in that sense, indeed, the auto-destruction of the Jews?
These key steps were taken very slowly. That is, of course, everyone from now looking back, you could say, why were people not immediately leaving the country already, let's say from May 1940? Because everyone could know, especially those people knowing the German Jewish and Austrian Jewish refugees, what happened in Germany, in the German Reich, especially also after the Anschluss. I mean, all Jews losing their jobs, losing their fundings, their houses, etc. So in that sense, everyone could expect what would have happened, and not only Jews, of course. In Germany, the project started with the persecution of political enemies, with socialists and communists, even liberals. I mean, even already in 1933, von Papen was already persecuted. I mean, those people who were supporting Hitler themselves from the Centrum parties. So everyone could have known what would have happened. But it's the illusion always that you think, well, we know the Germans, they are a civilized people, they will occupy us, they will do strange things in their own countries, we'll never do that in the Netherlands. We are in peace already since Habsburg period, let's say. So this was one big disillusion. And what is the mechanism? The mechanism is that the Germans, before they entered the Netherlands, had already made an Anschluss in Austria. Seyss-Inquart, don't forget, he was the leader of the Anschluss of Austria. Then Seyss-Inquart, the same Seyss-Inquart, was sent in 1939 with Good France to Poland to make the annexation of Poland possible, of parts of Poland, the Zwartengau, etc. And then Seyss-Inquart was sent from Poland to the Netherlands. So this was a very experienced staff which he had. I mean, they were the most experienced, no other one in the whole Europe. Maybe some people, especially in the Netherlands or England, with experience in let's say the Dutch Indies or India, had ever witnessed anything like this. But in European context, it had never happened that the same people were responsible for creating a kind of occupation, Anschluss, annexation, whatever you would call it, from one country to another, step by step. So when Seyss-Inquart entered the Netherlands, he knew exactly how to deal with it. He how to work slowly into a new kind of juridical structure, change the courts, for instance. I mean, all the processes we now see in Hungary and Poland, let's say, were in the same way happened in the Netherlands. At a certain moment, Nuremberg laws were officially also being part of the system, and nobody believed it because it was so completely different than anything you could believe. But another thing was, of course, the use of camps. There were in the Netherlands already, as we know, of course, also from this research of Leon Tocqué, all that kind of information, which is still every time strange to combine. But there was a social security system already since the unemployment, since the crisis of the 1930s, especially for people in the cities to work on the land. Reclamation work by this Moor company, the Heidemaatschappij. And so unemployed people, young people, were constantly sent from the cities to these camps. Now, these camps were taken over by the Germans immediately from 1940. They knew exactly where they were because they were already long before the Second World War in the Netherlands, investigating all the spots. They knew everyone, every person, everything they could use. This was not an unknown country for them. And so what you see is that this whole unemployment system, which was administered by social security officers in all Dutch communities, was completely taken over by the Germans. They were giving new instructions by no longer sending Dutch boys to these camps, but only Jews from all ages. And that happened within a few months. Around Amsterdam, some 20 of these camps were already filled with only Jews. And then the second instructions were change the number of camps. We bring them together. Let's say we integrate some 20 camps. We make them into 5, and then bring them to the middle of the country, or to the new lands. Let's say the new polders. Broader, larger projects. What the Germans call the Westkolonisation. I mean, the Polish project they called the Oostpolitisation. So from there, then the camps became concentrated in the eastern part of the country. So from Groningen to Limburg, already quite near Germany, and Westerbork was in between. Mm-hmm. So this happened already before the camps were emptied in 1942, and everyone had to be sent to Westerbork. And suddenly, from that moment on, Westerbork was taken over. Up to that time, it was still, how strange it seems, a German Jewish refugee camp with a Dutch director governing this camp but having people which he didn't know what to do with it. And then suddenly new barracks were built, and this whole large group of some 8,000 people from the unemployment camps were arriving. And a few weeks later, the Jewish Council had sent the addresses to The Hague of the children and the wives of all these male persons. And the 8,000 male persons then suddenly were accompanied in Westerbork by trains from Amsterdam by the wives and children. Now, let's say they all had a wife, that's 16,000. They all have 1, 2, 3 children. So there we are. We are already at some 20, 30,000 people, maybe. That's a third of the whole Holocaust. This happened without any kind of formal pogrom or institutionalization.
That is a large collaborative effort.
Exactly.
Is that achieved as a planned project?
Mm-hmm. Is that achieved by shifting the norm, by smoothly shifting the norm? Because what is surprising, okay, in Holland, there was the strike of February 41, which was a big response, especially in Amsterdam, against these measures against the Jews. So in some sense, you could argue this is where maybe Seyss-Inquart misread how easily society would go along in that process. Or do you think that was for them just a blip that could easily be suppressed and not a real concern?
Well, this is the February strike is the problem is that the February strike is, of course, in history, it has been very much politicized. So we all know that members of the Communist Party were organizing it, but after the war, that was not done to make that too clear, because there was, of course, always this general notion of how could they have organized it, because we had this Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, the Germans and the Soviet Union were working together, so it's impossible that the communists were doing this actually. But of course, the communists were organizing it, and they were the only one who could do it because they were the only one being underground already. They were in this command, and they have this control within the Amsterdam tram lines, within the harbor, for instance. All those people who were actually actively organizing, but of course supported by students and by all other kinds of groups, and Jews themselves, of course, not to forget, against what you could see as the first program, because this is another element which is not widely known, but what happened was that Amsterdam not only contained already in February 41 Jews from Amsterdam, but they also had brought already Jews from neighboring cities like Edam, for instance, or Zaans, the Zaan part of the Netherlands, the northern part of the Netherlands, were all brought already to Amsterdam, and they created and called that ghettos, officially in German, Judenkwartier. So there were planned 2 of them, one in south and one in the center of the city. Most known is, of course, that one in the center of the city, the oldest Jewish part of the city. And from there, you could get in, but you could not get out as a Jew. So that was already being done at that moment. And there were NSB, National Socialist Youth Organizations, walking there with marshes and teasing these Jews and making jokes and that kind of thing. And left-wing Jews in particular, who also were trained themselves in karate, fighting sports, etc. Of course, at that time, when nothing happened before, but this was before the pogroms, were fighting back. And at a certain moment, one of these fascists was killed by a Jewish boxer, and that was the moment when fascists started to create a kind of riots in this neighborhood. And the Germans had brought Jews from a kind of Zionist training camp in the north of the country, also to Amsterdam, who were themselves Zionists, not communists, but also militant. And this created an explosive atmosphere. And what happened that this riot then for the Germans was a kind of testing ground to find out what happened if we get them up in a kind of program, which we were trained doing that, of course, in Poland already for 2 years. And we take them all and send them to a new camp. This first camp was built in the Dune area in Schagen, this area, North Holland. It's a now unknown camp because it stayed only there for a year. It was only meant for communists and for this first group of Jews. And so they were kept out of there. And that was the moment when this strike started, this first strike in Europe against Jewish pogrom. And this had an enormous impact. And then the Nazis became very much irritated, but also shocked, because even for stubborn, let's say, National Socialists, they had this strange idea that the Dutch actually were also an Aryan people, actually kind of German people. And in the past, in the Habsburg period, there had always been one, empirical state. So why not having the Dutch as a sort of, even a kind of elite, maybe even in the German state? They had high respect of the Dutch. And then suddenly this happened in the capital. And not only between communists or whatever, but a broad support from Amsterdam people. Don't do anything to our Jews. We will fight back. That was a signal which was so strong that immediately created an idea. We have now to operate in a very systematic way, because the Dutch are stronger in resistance than we think. They have a kind of secret resistance, not the kind of thing you find in, let's say, in other countries where they shoot back all that, but they have this kind of community approach. So it was very important to use the mechanism of collaboration, finding out those Dutch people which you could use, by creating something which was almost, it was not like in Poland, let's say, by making it too explicit, but using the Dutch police, to find the Jews, and using Dutch organizations, and of course create this fiction of the Jewish Council by having them the fiction of self-control. What you see in Poland, for instance, in these ghettos like Lodz, that kind of system, that's what they used here, but in a way which looked more like the Dutch system of pillarization, like almost from, look, we have this socialist, and we have the Christians and the Catholics, and now you get also your organization, that we have a sort of contacts in The Hague, and that we don't have to have all these different. So that sort of spirit was behind it,
right?
And it worked.
But that also means, that Seyss-Inquart and his lieutenants had two models that they had to manage. On the one hand, there's a model of how does a society respond and how do we shape that, but also a model almost at the individual level, which is how do we make sure the members of a Jewish council keep on going along, settling all sorts of very conflicting challenges between, let's say, their own survival and that of other people. So how do you? What were these two models there? Was this also in some sense formalized by them? Was there really a rule book for that? Or how did they play that out?
Yeah, I think you could say there are two interpretations here. One is absolutely, it's true. There were these two models. One is, let's say, conciliation, moderation, tempering, being in contact, negotiations. And the other is what happened directly, for instance, after this February strike, is operating in a very, very aggressive, terrorized way. But you use another kind of instrument for that. For instance, the SS, an organization which normally is not to be found on the streets. So that you could say, okay, we had to do that. That was not. Now, the second thing is, you could say this is maybe these are the same people doing this, using these two models. I'm myself quite sure it works this way. But for Dutch historians in general, they have a more friendly interpretation, and they would say, now you had good guys and bad guys. Now, I'm not sure about that. I think good guys are very good in also being bad guys, but it has to do a lot also with Dutch trials. Let's say Gemmeker, the commander of Westerbork, sending these 60,000 Jews to Auschwitz. He was sentenced only for 6 years because actually he behaved like a gentleman, like a kind of Adolf Speer. Now, this is the way Dutch people generally like to see the situation. Because
that's very ironic, right? Because it means also current historians still believe the image that the Germans purposefully created.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. This is a very effective image. This is a very effective image. Mm-hmm. And it has a big impact in Dutch history. That because it's it is difficult to understand, of course, that the same person can be a Jekyll and Hyde. But it is completely understandable when you know also colonial regimes, how they work. They always work with collaboration, creating elites like the Dutch, the Indo elites, the mixed race people, of course, they collaborate. They work in the Dutch Royal Army. And on the other, you have the groups where these same people are used to send people to camps or to fight terrible wars. But these are invisible for the others. That's how it works. Now, let's say for Jews, the system was quite harsh from the beginning, and for communists. But for normal Dutch people, it wasn't bad at all. I mean, of course, there were bad situations, and especially the last years of the war were not that nice, but also because of the war events. But this regime worked in double ways. That is a general approach. Let's say one of my family members in the village I was born in Aalsmeer was sent to one of these subcamps of Neuengamme, and they were doing no more than some illegal journalist work. And these guys then, when nobody expected it, were suddenly catched up somewhere in October 43 or something like that, sent in a bad time to these camps, and then had to work in the subcamp, working on the Frisia Wall, a kind of Atlantic Wall project near Denmark. And this whole system was based that these people were probably in the Netherlands, let's say, friendly interrogated and been sent away with the promise that they had to do some work in a labor camp. But you know how it is. Within a few years, you're back. They arrived there, and within 3 months, they were dead. The same way the people from Putten, all these male people from Putten, this whole village was fired. Nobody knows why, but the male were sent to these same subcamps of Neuengamme and worked in the same way in the same period of the year, and all died within a few months. So these were actually extermination camps, death camps, which we don't know. Nobody has described the history of these camps because they are not fitting in the image. You think of Jews being killed in these camps. Nobody speaks about Dutch people being killed in comparable ways, or Russians, for instance, in these Russian camps.
But now, Rob, if we bring it back to the theme of collaboration in this case, you gave really very clear sketch on how this slowly played out in the Netherlands, right? And how the German occupier gained control using collaboration from these older nation state roots. And would you say that's also a recipe they followed within Germany itself and other Western European states? It was a generic approach that they took?
Yeah, but you could say that generally in the Eastern European parts, there was a lot of collaboration, but this was ideological collaboration. You could say this is collaborationism. And there was a lot of terror. So the combination of collaborationism, let's say by Catholic nationalists in Balkan states, or Ukrainian nationalists in Ukraine being very anti-communist, etc. All that sort of collaboration worked together with an extreme lot of terror, communists to Jews to minority groups, ethnical terror. And in the West, ethnical terror was not part of the system. It happened, of course, to Jews, but they were killed not in the West, they were killed in the East. They were first sent there to where terror was already normalized. In the West, you could say, the only terror they knew were actually some bombings during the first part of the war. If, for instance, in the Netherlands, the battles at the Grebbeberg, but also the bombing of Rotterdam, one of the first cities to be completely bombed by the Axis, by the Germans. Of course, the first was Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. But a combination with what happened in England, which was officially not occupied, but had a lot of these bombings, you could say this is the experience in the West for normal people, and of course the Battle of Arnhem later on in the second part of the war, the Liberation War. But the pogroms and the deportations of the Jews, these were very specific. These people were isolated in first instance, taken from their original neighborhoods and cities and towns, concentrated in these ghettos in some big towns like Rotterdam and Amsterdam. And from there, for instance, let's say I live myself in a small Dutch town where some 50 Jews were killed in Auschwitz, and so we were. But there was never a memorial up to the mid 60s for them. There was a monument for those people in resistance being killed, some 10 persons, but not for these Jews. Why not? I asked later on. I said, why did it never happen? I said, yeah, but these Jews were not, when they were killed, they were already not living in this place. They were sent to Amsterdam. So where they were sent from a ghetto to a camp, which means that the original place where they lived were not regarding them as their own victims.
They didn't belong.
Because there were no survivors. There was also no family so we only have a graveyard.
But if you look at the system in the Netherlands, and we would do some counterfactual reasoning on this, what could have been the response of Dutch society to disrupt this plan?
Well, the problem is, of course, when you don't have terror against total population, like in Poland, for instance. I mean, the Poles were not very friendly to Jews, but they suffered the same kind of occupying terror as the Jews themselves or the Ukrainians. So in that sense, that's what they shared. So it means that all of them were in a certain way in resistance. In the Netherlands, there was resistance only from let's say, from 1942 onwards, but most of the Jews were already sent to camps. It was, of course, based partly on finding hiding places for Jews, later on hiding places also for Dutch boys in particular, being threatened to be sent to the Eastern Front. But that was a kind of situation which was indirect terror. It was terror, but was indirect, was invisible. And which means that being in resistance it was risky, but was also against the sort of mentality people had, because they were very brave people and very civilized people, and you had to do what the government says. Also, even if the government is an occupying government, it's still a government. So it's not that easy to come into resistance. In the same way, when let's say, when a neighboring village would have been completely terrorized, then they would expect the whole population to go in resistance. It will not happen to us. But when something like that is not happening, but only some few civilians, some few young radicals were taken out, some communists. Yeah, I wouldn't say who cares, because people cared, but they knew it would not happen to me, because I am a normal. I'm doing my job. I've never been in politics and whatever. So that made this whole situation in the Netherlands. The resistance movement was actually very much related to some political parties underground, not even social democrats. They were generally not in resistance. Some groups were in resistance, but they could not trust themselves, because the greatest trade union was actually collaborating with the Germans.
But what could have done? Yeah, more strikes, or put more people in hiding?
It would have made a big difference if, for instance, these trade unions were, like in some other countries, were supporting resistance. That would make a big change. But by a lot of these former political parties and party members be not openly in resistance. I mean, some of them were not able to, because they were taken as hostages to some of the camps, in Vught, for instance, Sint-Michielsgestel. So that happened in many countries. Of course, you take the elite, and you bring them together to a camp, so they can no longer lead their own parties. Then you see these parties fragment. It happened also to the communists. The communists were working together, even with liberals, etc., in the underground. So everyone had to find new kind of collaborations in resistance. To use the same term also for the resistance movement. And you know how difficult it is, because you never know who you can trust. I mean, you work together with people who are also, but they could also be, of course, secret agents. Many of them were. And if they weren't, they were kept for a moment, sent to what is called one of these prisons, interrogated, martyred. Let's say, and of course they became, if they had to become almost, if they wanted to stay alive, a kind of spy or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So this happened in a very massive scale, and the intelligence of Germans was quite good, also because of the cooperation of all these local police people.
Right.
I mean, in Amsterdam, for instance, resistance was almost impossible because on every corner on the street there were police people the whole day, and they were all trained in Avigor. And Avigor was a center which was an SS training center. They even had a Jewish camp there, of which almost all Jews, when they were in the end sent to Westerbork, even Camp Commander Jemmerker had never seen people in such a worse condition. That he first sent them to the hospital of Westerbork before sending them to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the irony of all this is so crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this was a training camp for Amsterdam police people to become, let's say, Jew hunters. So many of these Amsterdam police, and don't forget, these Amsterdam police people were not trialed after the war, and they were still there, many of them, during the 1960s Provo movement. This is one of the explanations why Provo was provocating the police, because these were military trained, SS trained police people. And
that's amazing.
They were even honored after the war.
Wow.
Yeah.
But now, Rob, so what you're describing is that this notion of collaboration is an automatic consequence of having this relationship between a nation state and its citizens. So that means, given that structure in which we exist, we are all collaborating continuously, by necessity. But also, it shows also a vulnerability in that system, because the citizen is collaborative with this abstract construct of a nation state based on a sense of trust, a trust in that system. Like, the system is well intentioned towards us and the common good. And that's, in some sense, what the German occupier co-opted, because people could not break out of that assumed relationship of trust between themselves and the nation state. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yeah, exactly. This is absolutely correct. And it's not only on the kind of system as we now describe for the camps, for instance, which were not guarded by Germans, don't forget. Inside these camps, there were Jewish capos. So they were sent, Jews themselves sent other Jews into the trains. But outside, for instance, in Westerbork and other camps, also in Germany, in Westerbork were two police commands, battalions. And the battalions were one from Bremen, German city, a reserve battalion, which already had been fought in the Eastern Front, experience in the Russian war. And the others were an Amsterdam battalion, which probably also had some Eastern experience and were trained in Avigor. So actually, there were only 40 Germans who did the whole job, sending 107,000 people to the extermination camps. I mean, this explains everything about the term collaboration. But then there is also a positive kind of collaboration, not positive in the moral sense, but the Germans were also doing a lot of things. They were not only occupying and stealing and robbing, which they also did. They looted everything from the Jews, and sending the political enemies to the camps and the intellectuals and whatever you want, but also a lot of intellectuals and architects and engineers and whatever you want to have worked with them together and were very happy. Because if you look, for instance, to the restoration of Amsterdam city, if I look out of my window here, if I would change my screen, you would see all these buildings which were actually rebuilt during wartime in a city like Amsterdam, which was not destroyed. Because this was the golden period of heritage business, of what the Germans called Denkmalschutz. These were all collaborating. What they did was actually finding out what was, and that was their escape route. After the war, there were some trial investigations, and they said, yeah, you collaborated with the Germans. You worked in the kind of Heimat architectural works, rescheduling. But yeah, the problem was the Germans loved Rembrandt. The Germans loved the Dutch Golden Age. And so what all these architects said, no, we were actually playing with them, because the Germans didn't see that we were very Dutch nationalists. We were patriots. We were building in an old Dutch style. And that was their escape route. They didn't say, of course, that the Germans loved this old Dutch style. It was especially what they wanted them to do.
Mm-hmm. But now, given the model and the history behind it that you sketch on collaboration, now in the European context, we are shifting partially away from a nation state concept to one of a federated Europe. So what would be the consequences then of the sense of collaboration? Because it also means we have to reorient people's loyalties to an even more abstract entity of a European Union. So do you see that these forms of collaboration will then change as a result?
Yeah, this is actually the same process as what happened in the 19th century with the invention of the nation state. In first instance, you could say this was a cultural process. I mean, for some countries like Germany, this is also the official idea that there was already a kind of German people, starting with Herder, etc., from the late 18th century in music and in poetry and in philosophy. And after that came slowly the national German empire state. But this was, of course, not really how it really happened, because there is always this combination of political power and culture, because we all know culture is used also on the micro level. Always you don't build an opera hall because people like it, but you want to show the opera is already bringing you into kind of mood. It creates power. It creates the image of those people who are creating it, of the elite sitting there on the balcony and those, etc. So in that sense, this is also going on in Europe. Europe has been for a long time believed in the myth, you could say, of a Europe of different culture, different nations, as they call it, of regions, different regions. The idea was the nation state will slow down, and then what comes up for it is regional context. So let's say people in Germany could share some things with France in the same kind of regions, like Alsace-Lotharingen, for instance, or the Dutch in Limburg and those people in Eastern Geldern or whatever it's called in Germany, or in Belgium, Limburg. These could also share some sort of historical comparative, that they could share a culture, maybe even a dialect or something like that. In Northern Italy with Austria, etc. Now, we all know that this is a big mistake, because if ethnic war happens, it's always exactly in these regions. Let's say former Balkan wars in the 1990s. What happens is that neighbors are killing each other. Those people who share the same culture, they share the same language, but don't feel themselves still different because there is some sort of identification with another religion or whatever. It's always that it doesn't work this way. Culture is more, let's say, is as much divisive as it is shared, and it's not a base to build something on. You have to really start from the structure itself. And in Europe now, you could say it's a complete failure. You can say there are many cultures now working together in Europe, but maybe there is more affinity between, let's say, Geert Wilders or Thierry Baudet, this populist in Western European countries, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, than with their own prime minister. This culture of trust is being completely lost in a certain way. You even see it nowadays with this COVID-19 situation, that people create a kind of identity by being against vaccination, for instance. What could be before anti-Brexit, or could be Brexit in England? It is a sort of mostly regionally based, also in northern Italy, for instance, with Lega Nord, which then became suddenly a national party. And then suddenly also people in Sicily started to drop up and support that same party, which was 5 years before, if there was anything Lega Nord people hated, it were Sicilians. Mm-hmm. So you see, this cultural element is a fixing, floating thing. It's not something which really goes back to a past. All these pasts are invented. I mean, everything which people believe of being, I'm really Dutch or I'm really French, it's very nice, but this can change just as much as state borders can change. And that is the big issue of Europe, of course, that that it is based in a very, very meager program, because it brings together very, very different um, states of nation states together, you could say, which still, for a big part, are still being creating this nation state. I mean, in Western Europe, you could say, okay, the nation state is in fatigue. It's already slowing down. It's an old concept which people don't believe anymore. Western Europeans probably were ripe after the Second World War to start together and to create something on a new base together. But Eastern Europe, after the fall of communism, is only now reinventing its nation state. It's now using the models of the 19th century as being completely new. I mean, these people like Orban or all small dictators, their models are those dictators from the 1920s, 1930s, or whatever, who were dictators because they were fighting the outcome of the First World War. The Trianon Treaty, for instance, in Hungary. They wanted to become really big Hungary again. Or the Poles, who probably want to have Litovia or whatever, being their old borders back. They probably want to go to Odessa again. I mean, the craziness of these nationalism is what is in the head of people, and not being part of Europe. I mean, the Hungarians are part of Europe because they know that they earn a lot of money by Europe, and Europe is simply giving it to them without any kind of restriction.
But now, what will be the steps for Europe and the European Commission to guide this process in a constructive way? What would you see as the three most important measures they should take?
Yeah, this is a complex question, because you know that in our programs we only wanted to highlight many of these kind of cultural conflictive processes. I mean, I'm a historian, I'm a cultural scientist, and most people think I love history and I love culture. So in many of the debates in the past decades I've been, they always said, yeah, but you wanted to have more of these things in the education, for instance, of school. And I remember once being said that it said, no, it's better even than to stop history and no longer talk about culture, because there's nothing more divisive. When people start to define themselves in these terms. So if I belong to this culture and you belong to another culture, it means we don't share a heritage, for instance. Now, if you start a European project, you know how it worked in Europe. They really believed in a value community. It's not only an economic community, but also a value community. Now, that is beautiful, but how can you start a value community with all these politicians having their cultural agendas, these churches which still exist, all these national organizations, all these national histories, all these national culture projects, and broadcasting companies, etc., mostly owned by national politicians? That is completely impossible, because every politician knows you have to create a certain way, like in sports, a certain competition to win. So you start by making clear what the difference is between your party and the others. Now, in Western Europe, of course, we all know there is no difference. So there is no difference at all, not at least between a Christian Democrat, a social democrat, and whatever you can imagine else. It's simply the same. I mean, when they govern, they do the same thing. There's no difference. Even in the United States, you could say, in the end, in geopolitics, there is hardly any difference, even between Trump and Biden. It's in the end, the whole way they treat Russia or China or Europe, there is not that. It is different in tone, in style, but not in interest, not in long-term policy. Now, that is what lacks in Europe. Europe has not had any debate in geopolitical sense, because Europe is a weak, soft community of people with idealized ideas, no more Second World War, believing in culture and history, have this idea that they have this rich history, forget that they have a rich history basically based on war and on terror. I mean, every European country has been in war together or been in civil war. And that's where all this art comes from. They loot it. In every museum in Europe, you find looted art. Now, in that sense, they don't have to give it back to Africa, all of them. They can also give back it to each other. I mean, take the famous Jeroen Bosch painting. You're now in Spain. I mean, El Bosco, it's all looted art. It's looted by Alva from the palaces of the Orange family. Well, the Orange family is still there. They're monarchs if they would have some courage. they would go to the Spanish friends of them and say, well, give me our paintings back. I mean,
That's a good suggestion. But Rob, in that perspective, do you believe that if we take this European meta nation state that people pursue now, do you see that European citizens will be able to collaborate in that context in a sustainable and constructive way? Is it even possible?
Yeah, the double answer is actually that in the same way as you could make a difference between culture and collaboration on a citizen level and on a national state level. You could say the national state level by connecting these nation states to cultures, that is the worst thing. If you forget that and you can get people out of that frame and make clear that they share a common aim in Europe, which is make Europe safe, make it sustainable, also in terms of climate, etc. You do all these things which people share on whatever level. You create welfare systems that I think the European project will be a big success, as the European economic project before the EEG was a big success. For instance, after the Second World War, by its agrarian reconstruction. I mean, a continent completely devastated in 2-3 decades became one of the richest of the world. That nobody would have expected that. The ending of this enmity between Germany and France, for instance, had a lot to do with that. How to deal with sharing coals and mine, all these resources. Now we discussed it. I remember some years ago together already. What strange it is that we don't have such a complete lack of discussion about these main things. I mean, you see it in geopolitics. Conflicts now in the Southeast area between China, the US, Australia, the Southeast states, Indonesia, is all based on resources, on trade systems, like the Silk Road, for instance, between China, but all these European states. I mean, the harbor of Athens, which has been bought by the Chinese. Mm-hmm. How the fuck is it possible that Europe will make this possible? It's crazy that you make such big mistakes, that there is no discussion on that. That people like us, for instance, are not hired only to have this competition with research foundations, etc. Ask us to be in an advisory board to discuss these things and to think about long-term developments, not from a political party system, because that's of course how it works today, but really as a kind of long term, like it is in the US and all these normal other countries, that you bring these expertise together and think about how to create. This can be the big issue, the only big question: how to survive Europe for the 21st century.
Right,
because it's really not going in the right.
Okay, no, I you're right. There are concerns here, but now, as my last question, if you could change one thing by magic, right? You could change one thing to make this project sustainable and successful. What's the one thing you would change?
The strange answer is collaboration. because what we actually have in Europe, you work yourself in international projects and you know how it works. You have cooperation. We have a cooperation system, actually. Countries cooperate together, but it's not collaboration. And collaboration, if you would do it in the right way, it would mean like those projects of us, which we have, we do field work. We work on the same site and we think about it and we discuss it. Of course, let's say we need much more time and much more funding to make it really into a big success if we want to make it. But what works is when you have people from all these different parts of Europe together and bring them together and let them not speak their own language in this parliament and being part of these fictive parties, that you have people from former communists from Romania or whatever being part of the social democratic fraction in the European Parliament who don't have any idea the background of these people. They speak different languages. This is a guarantee for failure. And the only thing to let it make into a success is to let these people collaborate, and to collaborate not only on that level, but everywhere, on every European level, if it's a school system or whatever. Also, let's say even the secondary school, maybe already the primary schools, you could create these kind of collaboration, not fictive like what you now have with a Dutch town and a French town and an Eastern European town, and they have a kind of cooperation. Of course, this is nonsense, but really make it into a collaboration that you could say, okay, we share expertise. What can we do to fix these kind of problems? Let's say with sustainability, it could be very practical sustainability of buildings, let's say, of natural resources, of forests, whatever. How do you do that in Romania? What do you do in Poland? You have this old Polish forestry. A student of mine is doing an internship there. It's absolutely fabulous. But that you want to have on in a very, very keen way in politics, in geopolitics. And I think this kind of collaboration. This is then we should reinvent the term, let's say, in that sense. What you would really mean with collaboration, if you're a company, for instance, you don't want to have your people in different departments and that they don't know what they do for each other, like university, which still works with this craziness of disciplines. But what happens when you bring people together? You let them share these information. Now, that is what I mean. That's And I think the nice thing about European Research Project is that actually there you see a glimpse of what it could be. But as scientists, we even have a difficulty explaining our own colleagues in our own university what we're actually doing. We are a sort of
right.
Maybe we're the only Europeans, Paul.
Rob van der Laarse, thank you very much for this conversation.
Okay, it was my pleasure.
Hi, you listened to one of our podcasts in the series on collaboration, produced by the Instrument Forum and the Convergent Science Network. You can find more episodes on our website.